Awesome. So I'm happy to introduce Aviva Dunsinger, and she's a kindergarten teacher from the Hamilton area, and she's a very experienced OTS Connects presenter. It's wonderful that she's here to present with us, to teachers from all over Ontario about the problem of time. And I know that you're really going to enjoy this session. We went over it last night, and if you're looking for ideas on how to integrate so much content into your program, Aviva has some great suggestions and answers for you. So remember that we want to encourage as much interaction as possible. So Aviva, are you ready? And you can take over now.
Yes, I'm ready. Thanks very much, Mally. And thanks everyone else for coming out tonight, especially at the start of a week and maybe even a busy week, the week before March break, to come and learn about a topic that I'm quite passionate about. In the past couple of years, I've started using inquiry in the classroom, and I've done so with a number of grades. I actually started when I taught grade 5 a few years ago, and then became passionate about it and knew that I was really kind of embracing, I think, the thought process behind full-day kindergarten. So I knew I wanted to go back into primary, and then embraced it a little bit more last year when I taught grade 1, and again this year in kindergarten. And what I've tried to do tonight, because even though I am currently a kindergarten teacher, I have taught everything in some capacity from kindergarten to grade 6. And I kind of tried to pull from some different grades to hopefully give a roundabout or kind of a round-ish look at this topic, and one that I'm still really trying to figure out. I will certainly share some of my thinking when it comes to this concept of how to deal with time, but I'm hoping that everybody who's here tonight will also chime in. And even though I've tried to set up some activities for us to share some ideas throughout this presentation, please feel free, if you have other ideas, suggestions, activities, anything else, questions included, to put them in the chat box, and then we can talk about them throughout the session tonight, because hopefully you'll end up leaving the session with some new ideas and things to try, and I'm hoping to do the same, because this is certainly something that I think when it comes to inquiry, we have to figure out how are we going to deal with time. In order to really dig deep on something, we need to have the time in order to do so, and there's only so many hours in the day. So hopefully this session will help give you some ideas, but I'm also hoping that you'll share some of your own. To get started, I'm hoping that everybody will use actually the polling tool, which is now set up to an ABC option, to share what division you teach in. If you happen to teach in more than one, if you want to share some of your thinking in the chat box too, that would be great. And then hopefully I can tailor some examples to the different divisions tonight. Okay, a few primary, a few intermediate, lots primary actually, and some intermediate. Okay, oh, Shani's got big splits. Okay, 8, 5 to 8. Okay, and French and music. Perfect. Okay, so it looks like we have a bit of a split tonight. And as I said, I did try to take some different examples. But if you have some other ideas based on your own experiences or some questions based on your own experiences, please share. I see Melanie has quite the mixture in her occasional teacher job. And so again, she may have a few different ideas and things to share tonight as well. Okay, so with this, again with the ABC tool, how often do you integrate different subjects in the classroom? Now, I know that some of you teach, like for instance, Lisa, I know you teach French and music, so you may be a little more limited with regards to some of this, but I would say answer as best as you can, or if you have some ideas or more thoughts that you want to share in the chat box, by all means, please do. Excellent. Oh. Oh, awesome. Well, then it was wrong of me, Lisa, to make that assumption. That's fantastic. Teachers. Okay. Thanks, Mike. I've tried to kind of address the concern that you have here, Mike, with regards to teaching in French immersion and having the different subjects with the different teachers, with a few different ideas that I've tried in the past couple of years, but I don't know everybody's specific situation. So if you want to chime in with anything that you've tried or the concerns that you're still having, then hopefully maybe together we can brainstorm some options. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And I'd love to know, like Mike, when you say you're addressing the issues, I don't know if you can chime in or not through there, but it'd be interesting to know what it is that you're trying to do for that, too, and what maybe even different people have tried. And as somebody that doesn't know a lot about French and has only done a little bit of prep coverage before, I do certainly applaud that and the fact that it could be a lot more challenging in some regards because you are only offering that subject area over certain times of the day and things like that. So I'd love to, as I said, I'd love to know what different people have tried to do some of that integration, or to deal with the problems that kind of come up as a point of it, as a part of it, I should say. Health and illiteracy. Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Thanks, Mike. Okay. Thanks, Kristen. When you say you have 3 curriculum not including IEPs, what does that mean? Does that mean that you're teaching 3 different subject areas? Yes. You know what, Mike, I'm glad you mentioned the planning time piece. I will make sure that when I share a few of the examples of things that I do talk about that piece, because that was something that we had to play with too when we were looking at integration. So I will definitely share some of the things that we tried as well, and hopefully if other people have tried different things, they can share that too. Hold on. Okay. That's awesome. Okay. But reading and math for grade 6. Oh, okay. So, and I'm assuming, I remember kind of reading what you said before, Kristen, but I'm guessing you said the grade 6s come and join your class at a point during the day, right? So, so it'd become a, okay, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so I'm going to move on to our next slide, which would, some of this has already kind of been discussed, but if there's anything else you want to share, what are some different ways that you integrate different subjects? If you don't currently do so, how might you begin? Or if you're still having some of the problems that you've discussed too, then that's also something that we can talk about as well and kind of already have been. So if people want to share some of the different things they've tried, you can do it in the chat box as Monica just did, or if you want to use the little text tool, you can also add it right to the screen. I like your Mart. Math and art have some great connections as well. Oh, awesome. Consolidate ideas. Ooh. Stephanie, your phys ed and math comment is really interesting. I'd be interested in knowing what you do to combine those two areas. Oh yeah, drama and literacy, especially reading, go amazingly together. And actually just language in general, I think, because drama connects so nicely with oral language. I agree, Mike. Oh. Now, Joanne, when you say you connect social studies and readers theater, that's what I'm assuming the RT stands for, by the way. I was just wondering if this is something that you write on your own, or do you find subjects? Or, sorry, do you find some plays and things that align? Oh, perimeter forts in the snow. Oh, yes, I do love learning outside in the snow, too. Or is this just starting to melt? But oh, art. Okay. Social studies will combine nicely with art, too. Oh, yeah. Music goes so nicely with patterning, too, for math. I know a lot of my kindergartners that's really when they get into patterns, is with the use of music. Oh, now, Stephanie, did you paint the shapes on there, or are they already on your gym floor? Oh, math and science go really nicely together. Awesome. Thank you, Monica, for sharing all those examples. Actually, thank you, everybody. I can't believe how nicely the screen is filling up. Oh, awesome. Thanks, Stephanie. Now, I'm assuming it's Lisa, but I could be wrong. When you said about in French what you do, when you connect it, do you think of those connections yourself, or do you connect with the other teachers for those topics and then integrate from there? Oh, great idea, Mike, with the guided reading text. Actually, there's so many great ideas. Thank you, everybody, for sharing everything. Oh, thank you, Lisa. Oh, that's a great idea, Kevin. Now, Kevin, when you look at those connections to math and phys ed, do you kind of introduce the concept of angles but then do the measuring when it's back in the classroom through math, or do you actually do some of the measurement piece in the gym as well? Just curious. Yes, I really like the snow fort idea too. We did more painting of snow this year than snow forts, but and shoveling, but that would be a really awesome idea to actually connect it with measurement, which you didn't do. Okay. Oh, that's a wonderful idea, Kevin. Thank you. Okay, so as I can see, and I'm sure everyone else can too, from the ideas that are shared both in the chat box and on the screen, there's tons of different ideas shared here about integration and of what people are already doing or thinking about. And in fact, some of them will probably align with some of the ideas, excuse me, that you'll see in the coming slides. That said, if as we're looking at stuff through the slides, if you have questions or if you have some other ideas that you want to share, please feel free to keep adding to the chat box. I will try really hard to read through what's happening there as well as what's happening on the slides. But if I miss something, don't hesitate to put it back in there again, and I will definitely try to address that as well, because I want this to be as useful for you as possible. So I'm going to move off this slide and give an example that was shared here in terms of integration. So last year I taught grade 1, and one of the interests that had, oh yes, thanks Mally, raising your hand is a great idea. One of the interests that had come up in grade 1 was dinosaurs, and my kids loved reading and finding out about dinosaurs. But we also linked up with a grade 6 student last year, and the grade 6 student knew everything there was to know about dinosaurs. I was incredibly amazed by his dinosaur knowledge. And in fact, he was a really reluctant reader and writer. But what he was very interested in is teaching about dinosaurs to others. So I happened to do supervision duty, and he had told me when I was out on duty how much he loved teaching about dinosaurs, and I suggested that he make a some kind of slideshow or presentation that he could come down and deliver to my grade 1s to teach them. I said that they were really interested, that they didn't know much about it. And so that's exactly what he ended up doing. He ended up, we're a one-to-one iPad school for grades 4 to 8 as part of our board initiative. And so he used his iPad and he actually used Explain Everything, and he created a dinosaur presentation that he came down and he delivered to our class. Not only did he create it, but he is unbelievably amazing at creating clay sculptures of dinosaurs. And so like plasticine clay, and he can do all the little details. He knows every little last piece of it. And so he created those, and he took photographs of them to put in his presentation, but he also brought in some examples, and it really inspired my kids. So they really wanted to do more about dinosaurs and learn more about them, and they used all kinds of books and stuff in the classroom. And so I thought that I could link their dinosaur interests with our community. So we went out and we walked around our community and we had a look at what was in the community, and we started to think about different areas in the Hamilton community and what that might have been like during like dinosaur times. Like where would certain dinosaurs maybe want to live or not want to live? What kind of areas might be able to protect them? What would happen if they lived here now? And we did a whole bunch of different thinking, and we decided that we were going to create our own Hamilton Jurassic Park. And this became kind of an overarching idea that linked everything in our day. And so basically it started with reading and writing about dinosaurs, creating and brainstorming, which you can see here. We actually use PebbleGo, which is through our virtual library, and it reads information to the students, so they use that. They use real books as well. They used a combination of drawing and writing about it, as well as using apps such as My Story and Book Creator to actually create and even explain everything, to create some digital stories about dinosaurs and what they learned. And then we actually pulled it into the arts, and we actually created a dinosaur community, and we looked at the elements of design. We looked at, we also used the concept of math and measurement, figuring out how we were going to divide our area, looking at making things proportionate to each other. So, you know, what should be the biggest or tallest thing in what we created, what should be the smallest, how are we going to create that, what could we do to make something taller or smaller, how much taller or smaller should something be to something else. So we kind of put a whole bunch of different ideas together, and it really pulls in a whole bunch of the different subject areas. So it wasn't anymore about just teaching language or just teaching math. Our whole day was kind of this integrated conglomerate of sorts of inquiry related to the community as well as to dinosaurs, which was a topic of interest. And you can kind of see this is what I've come to kind of outline here, is some of the connections to each area. And I tried to write about how those different areas kind of came together. And that's kind of the planning when it comes to inquiry. We want to lead with the children's interests, but we want to know how those interests connect back to the curriculum expectations and how we can pull from that. And in fact, what I ended up doing last year is, instead of me being the one to outline the curriculum expectations, we looked at what the students wanted to do. And this actually came out of a blog post that I wrote about it, but we looked at what the students wanted to do. And we decided, after we outlined the kind of steps of the project, what the connections were to the curriculum. And we used that as our guide to ensure that the learning we were doing in the classroom was connecting back to the curriculum as well as to the topics of interest. And this was actually an idea that had come out of a comment on a blog post I wrote. When I say we, it was like myself and the students, so the classroom. This was not something that we did as part with the other grade 1 teachers. It could have been. Their class had kind of taken a different look when it came to the community, which was kind of the social studies topic. And so they didn't have the same interest that we did. And so as a class, we kind of went in this direction, where the other classes had gone kind of in a different direction as well. And I think that that's another important point when it comes to use of inquiry too, is that we want to listen to where our students and their interests lie, and then be able to also look at where those curriculum connections come in. And yes, yes, Elisa, I think even with the younger kids, it's really, really important to really link the curriculum for them and make those explicit links. Even my grade 1s, and I teach at a school currently with a number of really needy students. It's probably the lowest income school in our board, and despite that, I mean, I went through curriculum expectations with students. I brought it down to their level and their understanding, but we really talked about what that learning meant. So even though we may be, you know, playing, inquiring, going with something that is a topic of interest, that it is something that they understand, that there really is a link to specific expectations, and then we have to meet those expectations for learning. And so that's what allows them to look at kind of look at our outline for an activity and be able to make some really explicit links. So when it says that you want to, you know, read and write about different types of dinosaurs, that they knew, hold on, that's a language connection, and reading is one of our expectations, and so is writing. And when I write, I'm going to use these kinds of strategies. So they're really able to make those explicit connections. And I think that's something that we have to, like as teachers, we have to talk to them about that too, because this was the whole reason that I even outlined what the activity was and that we made those links to curriculum, is because I was really concerned about the fact that we were going to get off course, that they had a topic that they were really interested in. Our whole class was kind of becoming this Hamilton Jurassic Park, and I was concerned that we were getting kind of caught up in an exciting topic, but that we were going to lose sight of what we were trying to learn. And so we used kind of that guide that we wrote together to ensure that we were really explicit about our learning and that we kept coming back to those topics of interest. Yes, and that was my concern too, and that was actually what led to my blog post that actually resulted in this chart, because one of my old vice principals, who's almost a principal here in our board, Christy Curie-Bishop, she had written a blog post a number of years ago talking about a pink elephant. And there's a pink elephant in Hamilton. It's kind of painted that you have sight of. But the idea was that we start looking at the pink elephants in our room. And what's something that we really have to start kind of thinking about or wondering about in terms of, do we have any of those moments when we wonder, what are we teaching our kids? And I think that that was my concern. I was having one of those moments on, what am I teaching kids? And am I losing sight of what the learning has to be because the kids are getting kind of wrapped up in a topic that is really exciting for them? And so she was the one who suggested, well, why don't you make a list with them of what they want to learn, and why don't you make the links with them to the curriculum expectations, and then be kind of explicit that the other learning that they might want to do that connects to dinosaurs are things that maybe they can do at home, that they can do on some of their own time, but in the classroom our learning is going to connect to this because these are our curriculum expectations, and together this is what we've decided is important. And that's what we decided to do, and it was, I think, really powerful because it did keep us really focused on the learning, and it was still really rich learning, but it was something that didn't get us kind of off base and off track and losing sight of what those expectations are. And for anyone that's on Twitter, I'm going to actually mention Christy a couple of times tonight. She, even though I've moved schools right now and I don't teach at the same school as her, she really inspired me in a number of different ways when it comes to this topic, including the very topic itself. And so I think that she's someone worth looking into, especially looking at her blog as well, which I will mention on one of the other screens too. So I just put her name in there. But I think that she talks a lot about this concept of integration and what we can do and how we can make for this rich learning and how we can ensure that our students are learning and are learning based on those curriculum expectations. Now, the same kind of, I guess, inquiry-based thing happened when in grade 5, a couple years before, where we were learning about the human body. And we decided to have what it actually resulted in our big body bonanza. And so while we were starting to learn about the body and the organ systems, we moved into creating different organ systems, and students created them in groups and they researched them. But then in addition, we actually turned our whole classroom into the human body. We, oh, somebody has raised their hand here. Monica, did you want to share something, or did I miss something here? Did you want the microphone, Monica? Yeah. Oh. Okay. And by the way, thank you very much, Lisa. Yeah, Christy and I still kind of go back and forth a lot, and she was actually an inspiration with this particular topic too. Because as I said, we did actually turn our whole classroom into the human body. And again, we made links to visual arts and the elements of design. Students researched to find out about the different parts of the body, and then they made choices in terms of the displays that they made and how they made it. And then we actually invited other classes in for students to teach them about the different organ systems and the impact they had on each of the different organ systems. And you can see this part here. So they had to actually make a display, and then they actually had to create the organ system, and they needed to include some element of design in it as well. So we also worked into visual arts. But then we also went into music, and what the students had to do with music is they had to create a sound to go with their organ system. They had to make their own sound using like found sounds, and this is where we linked with our prep coverage teachers, because I didn't teach my own music that year. So I talked to our music teacher who was doing instrumental music with my students, and I asked her if she could help them, that this was kind of my idea and was it something she could do. And so I do have a video here, and it's the YouTube one that I don't know if Mally's already put it. No, she hasn't already put it in yet, but she'll add it to the chat box as well. But in this particular YouTube video, what the students, perfect. This is an example of one of the sound systems that what the students made. So they decided what kind of sound items they were going to do, and the music teacher actually laid out in her classroom a variety of different kind of found sounds, and students played with it, and she showed them how to make a soundscape. And they also created their own soundscape through there. And then I took kind of, after their learning, I brought it back into the classroom and gave them a chance to actually create their sound in the classroom as part of our time too. Here's to be willing. And I totally agree. I think that collaboration is key when it comes to inquiry, because to be totally honest with you, this is the problem. When you're trying to inquire and really get children to dig deep, no matter what age it is, they need time to do it. And we only have a fixed amount of time during the day. And when people are getting pulled for prep coverage and things like that, and students are going out into other subject areas, we can't make up that time. We can't get more time coming out of there. So if we can connect with teachers and get them to help us with this, it makes for richer learning. It helps students see the connection between the different subject areas, but it also gives sometimes even just a chance for that pre-teaching part. And this is exactly what happened. And I know that the topic had come up in terms of the amount of time needed to even do some of the planning. And this was really important here because I didn't have planning time with our music teacher. But what I did is I sent our music teacher an email explaining to her the assignment that I had, sharing some of my thinking about the music component that I'd like, and asking her if she thought it would be possible. She came to see me the next day. We spent about 10 minutes kind of brainstorming back and forth what might work. She showed me the soundscape. She said she would give them a chance to experiment with different sounds, and that she would leave out some found sound items that the students could take with them. Because I said that I would give them the time to record the sound back in my classroom, because she only saw them once a week. This project wasn't going to last weeks on end, and so I didn't want them to have to wait a whole other week to do the recording. But I thought if she could do the teaching part, I would give them the recording chance back in the classroom. So she did it. As I said, it probably ended up being about 15 minutes total between the email and the back and forth piece. And what she did is she recorded a video of that. So she got some documentation in terms of students experimenting. She had them do a soundscape. So she actually saw the soundscape and she gave them some feedback and stuff on that. And she actually ended up doing some other stuff with soundscapes and getting a mark from there as well. So we were able to combine in terms of that piece. And she was able to give them some feedback about the musical component that, with my background on music, I probably could have never given them anyways. So she kind of gave that piece together from there. And And then we were able to go and create our sounds for it. And as you can see through the pictures and some of the video piece too, there really is a lot of connections to the different subject areas, from the language, science, visual arts, music. It's all kind of there, and I think that that's what leads to this rich learning. But the other thing is as we were exploring it, it really was like a full day of learning. And so it wasn't broken apart. They had the long blocks of time that really allow students to go deeper. And then you can get into the reflection piece, which also has value. So in this particular case, we did some podcasting of the reflections, and you can hear it here. I had mentioned Christy before, and the kids actually gave her some kudos in their reflection, because what they had mentioned was the fact that they had missed that she couldn't come up to see the big body bonanza, but more than anything, they missed her hard questions because they loved the fact that it got them thinking. And so again, it kind of speaks to that value in working together. And in this case, it was really working together with the vice principal as well, because her questions got me thinking, but her questions also got the students thinking. And it also links back to the learning, which I think was something that Lisa had mentioned before, and that need to be really explicit with curriculum expectations. This piece, even though it was fun, even though they were really into it, and it wasn't just a reading and writing thing, but I think in this particular case, it was nice that they could, and I'm just going to move this up a little bit, it was nice that they could see those connections to the curriculum expectations. And this also goes into that assessment piece that happens too, because one of the things is that you can also get students that are reflecting throughout the process. So you can see with your questions, you can see the connections to the different curriculum areas through their reflections. These were some video reflections that students did, and I actually went and talked to them and then uploaded them as well. But sometimes students did their own reflections too. This particular group of students created their own video reflection. And so in this case, they were able to record some of their learning, and I was able to look back at the learning that had happened here and get a really good understanding in terms of what the students knew and any particular areas that might still be questionable, so that I could plan for mini lessons from there. And those mini lessons could take the place of maybe something to read, so it could be a language thing, or it could be something connected to the science part if it was something that was specifically related to a science topic. So again, you can pull in those different subject areas just by listening to some of their created reflections. And this leads to the question of, what impact does this subject integration have on assessment and evaluation? What do you already do, and what might you start doing? If you wanted to share some ideas either through the chat box or in the text tool, with the text tool, that would be great.
So Aviva, do you want me to put maybe 4 minutes on the timer for that?
Sure. That'll probably keep me focused. for the person who mentioned the conferencing piece, I hadn't actually thought of mentioning this resource, but if you haven't read Comprehension and Collaboration, here I'll write it in the chat box, Inquiry Circles in Action, I would highly recommend it. It gives some really good ideas about conferencing and how you can ask specific questions to students in groups in order to get some assessment from them and a real understanding in terms of where they're each at. And so it's a really good resource to read if you haven't read it before. What do you mean by your question, Kevin, about are you giving them multiple opportunities? I also wonder a bit, like, I know for myself when I'm planning, I try to think in terms of the curriculum connections that I'm most likely to make, but I will admit that sometimes as an inquiry starts to develop, sometimes students go in a slightly different way than I expect, and we might actually address different expectations than I initially thought, or maybe even more than I initially thought, or sometimes less. I'm finding that especially true this year in kindergarten for sure, because I kind of plan out in my head what I think is most likely to be addressed in each of the different areas in the room, but sometimes I'm quite surprised by what actually is. Yes, the rubric. Oh, thank you, Mally. Okay, so if people have other questions too or other things too that they want to add to the chat box, it might not go as planned. Yes, I agree, Mike. Please feel free. I'm just trying to kind of catch up on both sets of things. I just want to read what Kevin had written here. I agree. Oh, I totally agree with you, Kevin, about giving them that opportunity to make mistakes. And I think sometimes, even though we want to give kind of like many opportunities for students to go back and re-show their learning, and really that goes with the whole concept of growing success anyways, right? That at the same time, even just giving them the opportunity to go back, correct their mistake, explain their thinking. I mean, even in our big body bonanza that I had shown in the last one for grade 5, there were kids who had made some errors in sharing some of their thinking or answering some of the questions, including a question that actually my principal had asked at the time to one group of them. But I remember the students, and they knew that it didn't sound right. So they actually went on their break and they re-researched it, and then they commented. We took a video reflection of them sharing what they had thought and what they learned and what they thought now. And to me, that's just as powerful, if not more so, than them knowing everything at the beginning. I mean, I don't know everything at the beginning either. So I think it's great that we give students opportunities to go back and make those corrections, and that we're understanding of the fact that there can be mistakes that happen as part of the process, but that's the learning part that happens too. And it's interesting that you say about that assessment piece up front, because that also comes to that idea too of like a culminating task. And do we necessarily need to have one? In the last couple of slides, or the last few examples that I shared, I kind of did have what I guess would be like a culminating task of sorts, although in many ways it was kind of like the whole learning evolved to that point. And I wonder sometimes if it didn't, it doesn't matter. Like when we look now even at what growing success says too, could we sit down and have a discussion with students so that they share what they've learned on a particular topic? In some ways, like a knowledge building circle or something with students really making those links to curriculum expectations, could that happen too? And can we be flexible in terms of the learning that happens to maybe change our plans if things don't go exactly as they did? I don't know, I'm still trying to think my way through this, but I wonder sometimes when it comes to time, if one of the things that we're also struggling with time is sometimes the time of that culminating task. Sometimes it feels like forever when you're trying to track down a child to finish the task so you can move on to, you know, the next topic, or it's like you have a set amount of time to finish a big project and then the project doesn't happen in that set amount of time and you wonder how much more time do you want to give. I just wonder if sometimes we could go back and instead look at another way to share learning. Okay? And Mike, I think that point is such an important one to make, and it's one that I think keeps coming up too when we talk about inquiry. You know, we keep talking about process over product, but we still look at having that kind of final product because it's something that we're really comfortable with. And it actually, this whole idea came up at our last PA Day session as well, is in terms of really looking at, do we always need to have this big final product, and could some of those conversations count and kind of show the learning that happens too? And then that's a whole different way of looking at things. Oh yeah, and the observations, the anecdotals. I mean, the amount of stuff that you can get, I think of the amount of videos and things that I record or podcasts, and just sitting and listening and looking at kids and talking to them really gives a whole different perspective. And you can learn a lot about what students know on a topic and what they don't know and where the next steps have to go. And it doesn't always necessarily mean a big project. Yeah. For me. Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. And there's a lot of really good conversation piece happening here. And you know what, Sandra? I totally understand what you're saying here, because I'm going to admit that even though I rarely got to the end that I had in mind in the past few years on just about any topic that I've tried to create an end, and it's rarely looked like how I had planned, I still kind of usually look for what the end is likely to be. I think maybe it just makes me feel more comfortable to know that there is going to be an end, and here's what I'm thinking the learning is going to add to, and then trying to be flexible throughout, right? And it is definitely a challenge. Okay, so these are some of the ideas, and some of them were actually discussed too already, is that idea of rubrics and how you can actually pull from different subject areas in the rubric. And this is just the example of the one that I had done for the big body bonanza one, but I did actually pull from some visual arts as well as science as well as language pieces. So pulling from the different subject areas allowed me to evaluate those different areas too on what was kind of like your bigger kind of all-encompassing project of sorts. And the other piece is the idea of learning goals and success criteria for multiple subject areas. And I just gave a few examples here, and I wrote down what it said because it was a little hard to read in the image of what those learning goals were. But just recently I've presented for our board on social studies and looking at the new social studies curriculum, especially related to assessment and evaluation. And one topic that came up a lot was in terms of giving the mark, because even though we speak about the importance of feedback and we give a lot of feedback with it, how do we eventually end up giving the mark for it? And so this was where this whole idea of learning goals and success criteria came up. And in fact, in the most recent presentation I've just done, someone suggested almost looking at it like a one-point rubric, with the idea that the success criteria, if you meet everything on the list, becomes like a B. So if students are struggling in particular areas, you might fall to like a C, and if they're exceeding the expectations, then that's where you get to the A. And so it kind of gives the middle ground for the rubric, and from there you can adjust depending on what the students are able to do. this was kind of an interesting idea when it came to assessment and evaluation, and it was a nice way too, because even with success criteria, you can pull from different subject areas as well. So even though your learning goal or success criteria may be linked to, say, language or science or social studies, you can also then pull the specific success criteria from those different subject areas as well. And then again, you will eventually, as you evaluate it, come up with the mark piece that is our reality, regardless of how we may feel about giving it or not giving it. Now, the next piece is one that we've talked a little bit about already at the very beginning, but I just wondered, how have you connected with prep coverage teachers before to extend learning beyond your classroom? And if you haven't already, how might you do so, or what have you considered doing so? And I gave the one example of music, but I do have a few other examples to share too. If maybe, again, if you wanted to use the text tool, or if you wanted to add some ideas in the chat box, Molly, is it possible to maybe do like that, say, 3 or 4 minute timer as well, just to keep us on track? Again? Thanks. Okay. Oh, you know what? I think it's Dan here who mentioned the rubric idea. Sorry, I seem to be lagging a bit. This is a good example of what's called the messy rubric with that 1.1. And even though I haven't created an official messy rubric, the one that you're describing is that. And if you Google it, I'm trying to think on who wrote, I think it was Mark Barnes wrote a post, or at least it was on his blog, on the messy rubric. And you can also, if you're on Twitter, you might want to check out Joanne Corbin Harper at jcorbinh on Twitter. She has a really good example of a messy rubric, and she might even have some resources to share on it too. So if you ask Joanne, she could actually share an example of that. I don't have the example in here, but it's certainly one that you could share too. Oh, I love the idea of the teacher librarian. We only have a couple of periods with our teacher librarian as well, but what a great connection too. Oh, no problem, Dan. I know there is a really good example of that messy rubric, and as I said, I'm pretty sure it's on Mark Barnes's blog. And if you Google it and maybe his name, I bet you would come up with it. I'm trying to think what the name of his blog is, but he is on Twitter as well. So if you look at him on Twitter, you could actually probably even tweet him too. I don't know what his handle is. I think it might be it's either like @mbarnes or @markbarnes, I think. And he was he's the one as well who he would probably be able to share a link with you. Thanks, Sally. That's it. That's the one. Melanie found it. Thanks, Melanie. Yeah. And yes, Lisa, I think that's always what I've been told too, that the criteria for the success criteria is like the B, right, which would be like your level 3. And so if students can think like that, then they can almost like assess themselves, right? They can almost understand that if they're meeting all those expectations, then they're a 3, and then they go up or down from there. That's awesome. Thanks to the people that have shared too about what they've done too. I think it's a really great point to the person who said that you need to be willing to ask. That was the same thing too. Even for the music teacher who had done the work with my class that year, a lot of people, like she always worked on her own, and everybody just assumed that it was going to be a no. But until you ask, you don't know, and she was so willing to do it with the class, and we even looked at other ways during the year in which to connect to. So sometimes if we don't ask, we don't know what's possible, right? If we think that we're really missing out on something, or we think that another teacher could help give a connection to something that we couldn't, it's worth asking the question. Oh, that's great, Lisa. It's awesome to hear that the stuff that you're doing now too has that impact as well. But yeah, I think, you know what, I think it's important for all students, regardless of the grade, to be aware, at least even at their own level, in terms of what those expectations are. If students are being evaluated on curriculum expectations, then it's good for them to understand those expectations and kind of understand why they're learning what they're learning, or what we can do to help. Oh, that's an excellent idea too, Rachel, with the Google Drive. I don't know about your board, but ours has a Google Apps for Ed account, and so we all have our own Google Drives through the board as well, so this is a really easy way to share it. Oh yeah, that's awesome. You know what, that's honestly not something I've done before, which is funny because I email all the time and I do use Google, but I hadn't even thought of doing that, but that's a great idea. To share too. And again, a really easy way to share, because planning time is limited, and that was an idea that was mentioned before too, is we don't necessarily have a lot of planning time to go and sit down and talk to people. So it's nice that we can share with people in a different way, and electronically certainly works. That's awesome, Mike, that you do that too. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide, but if you have more ideas, please share them here. That's a great idea. Oh, that's awesome. I hope you do. You know what? Google is such an easy way to share it too. Google Drive, once people get into it, is so easy to share it. So I hope other people do. I'm totally going to try this idea as well, because as I said, I email constantly, but I hadn't even thought of using Google Drive for it. Okay, so this was the one example I had given before with regards to the music teacher and the found sounds, and this is just a video link to what she had done. So you can kind of see from there what she had done with the students, and then we use kind of this intro lesson as the jumping off point for the creation, which we ended up doing in our classroom. We also did it last year in grade 1, and it was funny. It was just one morning I happened to be looking on Instagram, and I saw this really neat idea with people understanding the concept of stability through yoga. So I tweeted the two phys ed teachers at the time, and I shared the link with them to the Instagram post, and I asked if this was something that they thought they could do. And one of them, who had my kids later that day, wrote me back and said, oh sure, absolutely. And we were learning all about structures, and I thought for some of my kids that having the chance to really explore their bodies with structures would help them understand what the stability was all about. So I kind of planted the seed, and he wrote me back and said no problem. He saw me at the beginning of lunch and shared his idea of what he was going to try to do. He asked if that was okay, if that would make the link, and I gave him some of the structure vocabulary that we had been using, so he was able to kind of reinforce that in the classroom. And then he tweeted me this pic collage of what he had done with the students to understand the concept of structures, and then we used this pic collage the next day. I pulled it up on the smartboard, and we were able to use this as the starting point for then a further look at what stability might mean and what we would have to consider in the structures that we built. It can also be used for developing schema. And for the school where I teach at, this is really important because a lot of my students don't necessarily come with all the background knowledge. And so having some of it developed beforehand in whatever that topic happens to be helps a lot when it's being used afterwards. Oh, and Evelyn, it worked out so nicely, those yoga structures. I have to admit, even in kindergarten now, where the concept of structures come out a lot in science too, and my kids, a group of them, are really into yoga. We've looked at putting those two ideas together too, and it really helps them understand the concept of balance, especially with using their bodies. So it's great for getting the vocab piece too. So in this particular case, again, I had tweeted out because I wanted to develop with math kind of like real world learning with math. And I had asked a question about when students might use non-standard measurements. So someone had given me an example of bocce ball might be a good example of like their real world. So again, I tweeted the phys ed teachers. One of them wrote me back right away and said, oh sure, I'd love to help. We sat down at lunch one day for about 20 minutes and we came up with a plan, and what he was going to do is he was going to teach it to the kids in class so they understood the rules of the game and how to play it. And then what I ended up doing is I borrowed the bocce ball kit and brought it up to the classroom, and then we incorporated the measurement piece from there. So he built the schema in terms of how to play the game, and I brought in the math component up in the classroom after, and then I didn't have to spend the time teaching them how to play the game. They already knew that piece. I could bring in the component that led to kind of the learning from my assessment point. And the other piece is that whole idea of looking at how prep coverage can actually extend the learning that's happening in the classroom. And this is something that I've started doing this year in kindergarten. And I blogged about it professionally recently because of even a different change that I had made. So initially when I started the year, I had 2 prep coverages that were covered in the classroom. And initially we talked and she decided that she was going to teach health to the kids, and then we stopped the program and she did the health. But my students were really struggling with that start and stop and that transition piece. So instead of stopping the program, we looked at what we were already doing in the classroom, and now she just extends the learning. She comes up with, we talk about during the week some of the things that we're already learning, and she gives some little ideas of something she might try. And usually she comes up with like a small little activity that she could put at one of the tables, and she sits down there and a group of students come over to her. And so instead of stopping everything else, the room kind of continues, the flow of the day continues. She doesn't stop it, but she extends it with what the students are already interested in. This was really beneficial for a few of my students. I have about 6 that really struggle with the start and stop. And this was happening a lot on what was our day ones because the students were going up to library for prac, and then we had a phys ed time later in the day, and it was constantly broken apart. And one day I had a student and she was really, really struggling. And it wasn't just on this one day, but it was consistently on this day 1 schedule. So my partner and I looked at it and we talked about what we could do to make things easier for her, but also to make the learning a little richer. And so we ended up asking our librarian about coming down to the classroom, and instead of our students going up to the library, he now kind of brings the library down to the classroom. He extends the learning in the class, but he also brings down some materials from the library that will be of interest. And sometimes as students are sitting and having kind of an open snack time, he sits and and he reads with them. He gets down on the floor and he plays with them. He talks to them. He brings some books that will be of interest to them. But now the learning doesn't stop. It's been some of the best day ones in a really long time. We also re-looked at our phys ed at the end of the day, and we actually extend it with some gross motor skills in the classroom. We've decided to not take the children over to the gym. They do go on a number of other days, and we do have the option of taking a small group if we wanted to. But again, we were really finding that the students were struggling to stop the learning. So extending it as part of the classroom has become a lot more beneficial for them. They're calmer, but they're also learning more. And I think that was the really big piece. Is really looking at how to make the learning not separate, but to make the learning kind of a continuation. And even though I must admit I do love having the classroom to kind of prep and do things in, and 2 days a week my students do go to phys ed, and I do have that piece. At the same time, I'm happy to have students that are eager to learn, and with that in mind, I'm almost happy with the new way instead of just the start and stop. And this kind of brought me back to something that Angie Harrison, she's Techie Ange on Twitter, and she had mentioned it a number of years ago actually when I had started to do prep coverage too. She was the one who mentioned that a prep shouldn't disrupt the day for kids. It should continue to flow so kids continue to work and play and teachers adjust to their learning. And that was a really big point for me. And I think that it made a really big impact this year as well. And I had blogged about it a couple of years ago, and it's funny to look back on that now and see that there is still a lot of overlap in terms of that thinking and the benefit it can have for kids to extend the learning. And yeah, and I agree, Stephanie. I think the start and stop time is really, really hard. And I was thrilled that I had a few teachers that were really willing to play along with me and come into the classroom to extend the learning instead of bringing kids out. Even just sometimes to start, like I have a phys ed teacher who now comes in and just gradually transitions them. So instead of like bell goes and they all line up, we do a more gradual transition. Sometimes that means that I clean them up a little bit earlier so we can start moving towards the gym, and sometimes it means that they come in and they slowly transition them. So maybe they don't leave exactly at the bell, and that's okay. Sorry. To stop the learning. And I agree. And you know what, Kevin, sometimes it's really hard and there's nothing we can do. If there really isn't, if there's nothing that can happen, I'll admit that sometimes I've seen what I can do to help the kids that are struggling. So I have a couple kids where the transition times are brutal and almost always result in tears, almost always. And so if I know that for whatever reason we're going to have to transition at that time or they're going to have to move, then sometimes I work, and I'm lucky, I am in a kindergarten class right now. I work with an amazing partner, and we arrange for one of us to transition them a few minutes earlier so that they're already in the new location and they're already settled in there when the rest of the group comes down. And that's worked really well too, but it is a lot of playing around. And it's hard if the room isn't available, if because of, other coverage times and stuff, there's not a perfect system. But certainly anything that can be done, even, and this was something Angie had spoken about a number of years ago, like almost 3 years ago now, I guess. But one of the things that she spoke about was even just seeing, sometimes it's just a few minutes. So, for instance, do we have to move exactly on that bell? Or could we spend just a few minutes transitioning over? Could the first activity by that teacher happen in that room? Could the child that's struggling the most maybe move over a few minutes earlier? I don't know, but when it comes to this whole concept of time too, sometimes I think we need more fluid time, which also includes having those larger blocks, and that's really hard when it's a start, stop, start, stop. And so whatever we can do to kind of get those larger blocks, I think can be really beneficial for kids, and then we end up getting the most out of them. Now comes to the big concept of letting it go, and this is something that I will share shortly, and I'm cognizant of the time, so we won't do too much time here, but I would like people to share. You know what? There's a fixed amount of time in a day. And so with that in mind, what could you let go so that you have more time for deeper learning? Or what have you let go already? If you wanted to share either in the chat box or on the screen, and then maybe we'll just kind of keep it to 3 or 4 minutes just because of our time. And I'll move faster-ish. Taking up homework. Checking agendas. It's interesting when you mention about the structured grammar lessons. You know what, I don't think there's anything wrong necessarily with teaching grammar or spelling. Some kids need it. I guess the big question is, do they all need it? And if they don't, then is that something that has to happen with the full group, or is that something that could happen as part of a small group for those students that do, and then provides us again with a little more time? Oh, pre-cut crafts. Yes. I don't know who said that, but I would really like to applaud. Yeah. Oh yeah, for summer school, for sure. You're so limited on time. Oh yeah. Yeah, and you know what, Kevin? I think what you speak to is, again, the need for differentiated instruction and knowing your learners. And some might need more scaffolding. And for the person who said about being a bit of a hanger-oner, I agree, and it's hard. But I think what ends up happening is that we come up with this idea that, oh my gosh, there's something else added. Just when we had to do, you know, learning goals and success criteria, now we've got to do inquiry, and there's something else that we've got to add to it. And all of a sudden it's like, I don't have any more time in the day, I can't do it. So if we want to make time, then we have to decide what's maybe the most important. Let a class go. That's a great idea. I like that answer, Rachel. Oh, packages of notes, a great one too. Get rid of dictees, but instead need something to replace word or word work. For the person who just wrote down that they got rid of, oh, dictates, never mind. Apparently my French is a little bit off. I just figured that one out. But need something to replace word work. Just learned French today. Okay, and for the person who's just writing down about doing attendance out loud, it's very funny that you wrote that down, because last year I always used to pull the attendance up on the smartboard in the morning, and my kids would, you know, read with me each of the names that were on there, and we go through and we do it, and I do it again in the middle block because that's what I was supposed to do, and I pulled it up. And one day one of my grade ones said to me, she's like, why are we doing this together? She's like, we know who's away. Like, can't you just like write it down? Like, do we all have to see and go through this all the time together? And I thought, like, even though I thought at the time it was good because they could all read the names, and they did, the other part of me realized the amount of time that we spent doing attendance as a full class. It was like 10 minutes a day. And even though 10 minutes a day doesn't sound like a lot, it's like, well, you know what, we probably could spend those 10 minutes doing something else. So, yeah, they were very right. Oh my gosh, I totally love the book Eat, Shoots, and Leaves. That's, I think, my favorite book of all time. It totally adds up in a month. And I didn't even realize it at the time, and then when my grade 1 student said it to me, I was like, oh my gosh, I could really use that time differently. And that was the last time we did attendance as a class. Oh, I know. I got to tell you something this year, though, Kristen. When my kids come in, and I teach kindergarten, but they come in the morning and they sign in and they just naturally go to whatever they're doing, and they actually work right through the announcements. I just tell them they have to be quiet, but they work right through. We stand, we sing, "Oh Canada," but the working, learning, it doesn't stop. There's even some whisper conversations. They just keep it low enough that I can hear in case there's a really important announcement. But I must say it does work nicely to not waste the time in between. Oh, yes. Yes, the calendar. I don't do that in kindergarten now either, but yes, that is something as well. And again, even thinking about, I guess all of these come up with the question of, it's kind of asking those hard whys. And I want to say hard whys because we've all made choices to do these things in the past. So it's questioning, why might we stop them? Why do we have them? And do we really need them? Now I'm going to move on in the slides, but if you do have other ideas, I will really try hard to keep up with the chat box too. So feel free to add the ideas in there too. This idea again came from Christy. I've mentioned this before. She wrote this blog post. It was a very, very eye-opening one for me. And I think at exactly the time that I needed it, because I was thinking a lot about time, and it was, I just can't handle it. I don't know how I'm going to get all the extra time that I need. And so she wrote this post that talked about letting it go, and that she kind of had this eye-opening experience too, that even for educators, that maybe we do have to let some things go if we want to get into inquiry. And so she spoke a bit about it. There's some interesting comments in the comment box too, but I think it provides a lot of food for thought. And I mean, I kind of shared what I had considered letting go, and I think did some blogging of my own afterwards. And I'm going to share a little bit here in terms of what I've let go. So I initially let go of my initial full class lesson each morning. And I did this in grade 1 last year. I've done it again in kindergarten this year, and I probably do it if I taught junior too. I don't start the day with a lesson. I put out some provocations and things to get students talking and working, and then I just kind of let it smoothly move itself into that next learning piece depending on what they do with it. And again, it's given some time. The whole class lesson, I found that, you know what, I wasn't really targeting where everyone needed to be. So it was better to sit down and work with some small groups instead of working with the full class. And I'm going to say to Lisa, to Stephanie, who had made the comment about the courage of letting go of the full class lesson each morning. This year has been a really eye-opening and I guess uncomfortable one for me, if you want to say it, because I don't teach anything to my full class ever. Based on the needs of students and where they're at and a whole variety of needs, it was just becoming more of a management problem than it needed to be, and students really weren't learning, and they were telling me what they needed, and I realized that everything I could do, I could probably do better as part of a small group. And letting go of all of those full class lessons and spending more time working individually and in small groups have been like quite eye-opening, and yes, a really big challenge, not gonna lie. But it was a really big thing to let go of, and it did lead to some it did lead to some good learning. I also let go of week-long shared reading text for the full class. I found that, again, it wasn't necessarily targeting where everyone was at. So instead of doing that, we looked at different ways that we could do shared reading, some small group shared reading, as well as shared reading that could happen during the day and not necessarily the week-long text that we kept re-exploring but really wasn't meeting everyone's needs. I also let go of guided reading time, and I say to an extent because I have not given up on guided reading. But I just made some choices in terms of who really needed a guided reading and who could have reading that maybe happened within the context of the learning that was happening. So maybe I sat and did more one-to-one or small group stuff kind of within the learning instead of pulling a guided reading group. And so again, kind of re-exploring where the students were at to give more time to spend with the students that needed it. And that also meant connecting the guided reading and inquiry piece too, which was an idea that someone else had mentioned earlier on. This was one that I shared, and there is actually a link in here to the author of 100 Minutes, Lisa Donahue, and she was the one who gave me the idea as well. So the link is in the blog post, but it kind of gives that connection too. And again, led for a little more richer, deeper learning, but not your typical guided reading group. I also let go of the same read aloud for everyone. I realized this year that that same read aloud wasn't working for everyone. For some it was too much text and they weren't there yet. So I kind of looked at the different needs of the kids, and I've actually done a lot more read aloud time even as the students are having their open snack, where I sit down with the group of students that are there. I pick the text that we're going to do, and we sit and we talk and we read the text as the students are eating, and it's made a really big difference for them too, and re-looking at what those texts may be. And I just realized that I've missed some stuff. When I'm teaching small groups all the time, the kids are already, like, they're into either their play-based or inquiry-based topic. They're sitting, they're reading, they're discussing, they're working together, they're recording. They're actually quite independent workers in that case. With my kindergartners this year, it is my partner and I. So if one of us is sitting with a small group, another person is kind of working as part of the whole class. And again, like even last year, because they had a lot more choice that was there, again, it increases the engagement, which decreases some of the problems. And with that in mind, then you get a little bit more from it. Stephanie, if you want to email me anything, I think my email address was given at the very beginning here, but if you wanted to email me some of your thinking so we could get more into it, I'm certainly more than willing to share some of the different things that I've done. It's been a learning experience for me too, but hold on. Yes, sure. Okay, intermediates don't do that so well. Any suggestions? I think I've missed what it is that we're doing with the suggestions. Oh, okay. You talked to. Sorry. Oh, perfect. Oh, the guided reading groups? Well, you know what? The example here, again, I would actually connect with Joanne Corbin Harper, G Corbin H on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, I'd suggest giving her a tweet. She taught grade 8 just before she became an instructional coach. She did for a number of years. And she actually did some small group reading piece, almost like a guided reading group, similar to some of the stuff that I had tried. She did that with her grade 8s, and she could give you even some specific examples too in terms of how it worked. I see someone here just shared about the idea of literature circles as well. And I think she also did some literature circles too. But I would certainly, if you happen to be on Twitter, I might actually consider tweeting her and seeing. I bet she would share some ideas with you for sure, and she might even know some other people to connect with too that could give you more of that grade 8 perspective as well. The other thing I let go of, oh no problem, is teaching phonemic awareness in isolation. And I say that because our school and our board is really looking at phonemic awareness skills and developing it. We have a large number of students that are below benchmarks in reading, and we were pulling all kinds of small groups and just kind of teaching those skills in isolation, and the kids weren't picking them up. So again, looking at ways of connecting it with the learning that was happening to help students understand it. So, and again, it helps with not spending time. It was like the person who gave the example of not doing the whole grammar lesson. It's the same little idea. It's that instead of trying to teach that skill on its own, by being able to connect it with something else, it made a really big difference, and I wasn't spending as much time doing it. Oh, yes. Thanks, Lisa. No problem. Okay, so we are nearing the end, and it looks like my timing, I've managed to pick up the pace a little bit, which is good. I was worried there. What's something new that you learned tonight that you plan on trying? If you'd like to share, I know usually I like to try to hopefully get something new out of a presentation or out of a discussion. So hopefully you've learned something that you'd like to try. And if you wanted to share it either in the discussion area or on here, or if you didn't learn anything, you can be honest and tell me that too, and I won't be offended.
So we will put 3 minutes left. Is that okay?
Perfect. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. You know what? The wording on the messy rubric is so nice. I actually think it's a kind of rubric where people at the end could take something and actually feel like they're actually paying attention to the rubric. Oh, yes. Joyce, supporting people I think would be great. And you know what? I bet that the other teachers would be really open for that too, because they would like the idea that someone was helping to support them and you kind of help them with the concept of time. Oh, perfect. Yeah, and for the person who mentioned small groups, I'm not gonna pretend that it was easy. Like I kind of think that as a teacher, it's almost like ingrained in us to think that the kids aren't learning unless we've got them all together, like on a carbon, and we're delivering the lesson. So it's a very different way of delivering it. And in the past couple of years, it's really been students and their needs that have forced me to rethink it. But it's been a huge rethink, but in a really positive way. Oh, yeah. Awesome. It seems like the messy rubric was a big success. It is a really good one. I totally agree. And you know what? I think this whole concept of less structure is, like, I almost get a little scared to say it, because even though I don't have a ton of like really firm structure in place, I will say that the room's not chaotic. And I think that sometimes we see like structure, like a lack of structure and chaos as being almost like overlapping. So it is providing enough of the structure, or at least enough of the engagement value, that we're not running into like chaos, because that kind of chaotic atmosphere is not going to be beneficial to learning. Okay, so because of our time, I will move to the next and final slide, and it is something that we've kind of discussed a bit already, but that said, in case I kind of missed anything, and I know there were some other discussions happening too, what questions or concerns do you still have? And if you want to use the text tool, this could be a way for anyone else who has some suggestions. And add it to. Okay. The resources for the language piece are hard. I will say, like, I've had to create some of my own in the past, or the other thing is I look for the curriculum piece and then kind of explore the language, right? Because if they're reading, then you've kind of got the language piece that goes from there. Also checking out anything that your board may have online. Like, I know our board subscribes to things like PebbleGo, which provides some great connections, and they've got like junior intermediate options as well. So that can also help with your language link. We also have an instructional coach, too. I don't know, different boards probably call them different things, but sometimes even connecting with them and seeing if they have some suggestions can be really beneficial too. So, you know, realizing that we don't all have to do it on our own, and even just connecting through Twitter and seeing what people have can be a good way too. Oh, that's a really neat idea, what Kevin had said about personalizing their rubrics. I'd be interested in knowing more. Oh, thank you. I wonder too, like, and maybe the way that also happens with personalizing piece is if we look with the concept of overall expectations too, then students can share their learning in many different ways, and we can still meet all those different expectations. Okay, so I know we are just passing 9 o'clock, or around 9 o'clock, I think. So thank you, everyone that came in, and for all the participation tonight. It was awesome. And if you have any other questions or something, feel free to connect. Oh, thank you so much, Mike. And yeah, email or connect online anytime. I do tweet a lot too. Thanks, everyone.
I'm just putting Aviva's contact information in here, and thanks, Aviva. That was an absolutely fantastic presentation, and as a retired teacher, I wish that I had people on my team like you that to play with, because it's just really inspiring to see what you're doing with those kids, and I love your whole concept of let it go. I think that's just that's my takeaway from tonight. So I just want to remind everybody, and thank you for coming and staying. If you could possibly, when you log out of the session, a feedback link will come up, and it is if you could fill it out, that would be great feedback for Aviva and also for OTS. And more importantly than is to provide the Ministry of Education with feedback, because they're the ones that have subsidized or have given grants for this incredible program to happen. And we all know that we're going to give great kudos to Aviva for this, and it was a fantastic session. Also, the links will be sent either tomorrow or the next day. The links for the recording and also for all of the resources will also be listed again in case you weren't able to capture those. So, and I know that there's a lot of material that Aviva covered. Now we know that we're winding up to March break. Even retired teachers know that March break is coming up in just a few days. But we have 3 more sessions before the break, and then another jam-packed month for March and April. So if you'd like to participate in any of the next upcoming sessions, you can go to the OTS website to register. So once again, if you could please fill in the survey, that would be fabulous. It just takes a couple of minutes, and have a wonderful night. And thank you very much.